Are you, Kevin? I hadn't seen my grandson Kevin since he was in elementary school, but I was sure. Kevin must be a 10th grader now, so the age matches up. However, I didn't recognize the child he was carrying on his back.
Grandma, it's been a long time.
Tears distorted my vision. I didn't know what to say, torn between the painful sight and the joy of reunion. The grown-up Kevin, unlike me, never showed his emotions openly.
Please, let us stay tonight.
I didn't know what had happened, but there must be a reason they were here, underdressed on such a snowy day. How hard must it have been to walk this distance in the snow, carrying a child on his back? The child on his back was shivering. His hands and feet were reddish black from the cold, and his lips were turning blue. Kevin's legs were trembling, barely able to hold the child any longer. I was about to nod in agreement, as if to say, of course.
Don't be ridiculous. I can take care of that kid.
Stomping loudly, my husband Fred, who should have been watching TV in the back of the house, came to the entrance. He seemed to have overheard our conversation. Even I, who had been with him for so long, flinched at his reaction. So a high schooler like him must have been terrified. But then,
I see.
he said, with a wry smile. It was a hollow smile, twisting only his mouth, as if everything was as he expected. My name is Olivia. I live a relaxed life in a suburb a bit away from the city center. I'm in my late 60s now, and since my husband Fred has retired, we're living on our pension. Fred has always been extremely stubborn and difficult. When he was working, there seemed to be a lot of conflicts and trouble. But those who knew him well understood that Fred was just awkward. He's always hated anything dishonest, and once he made up his mind, he rarely changed it. He was also terrible at expressing his emotions. Back then, I knew that Fred was more stubborn and awkward than others, so I often stepped in to smooth things over. Although I wasn't as competent in my job as he was, I was good at socializing. In a way, we were like oil and water, but we naturally got along. From there, we developed a give-and-take relationship, eventually dating and getting married. After we married, we quickly had a son. I think even the stubborn Fred was pouring his love into him in his own way. Thanks to that, our son Mark grew up well and now has a son, Kevin. We thought the peak of happiness would continue, but it didn't turn out that way. We've become estranged from Mark since a few years ago. A big fight between Fred and Mark was the start of the rift. I would usually stay neutral, but this time I had to side with Fred, so I haven't seen my son for years. That's also why I haven't been able to see Kevin. I dearly miss him, my first grandchild, but there's probably nothing I can do. All this is probably because of Mark's married life. Mark had been dating a girl named Anna since his student days. Anna lived nearby, and our families were close, so Fred and I truly blessed their marriage. I remember Fred's face brightening up like a different person when Kevin was born, lifting his grandson in his arms. I think it was around the time Kevin started elementary school that Anna began talking to us about Mark frequently.
Mark's been coming home late. He's often working overtime and on weekends.
I was struck by Anna's genuine concern for Mark. With a young child at home, Mark's overtime and weekend work must have been incredibly stressful for her. My husband was a workaholic too, and it was terribly hard. That's why I could deeply understand Anna's feelings. I also reached out to Mark several times. My concern for Mark was no different. Working too hard can break you physically, and if the company is that bad, considering reporting to the appropriate authorities should be on the table. That's what I advised. Before I finished speaking, Mark sighed dramatically and shouted, "Times have changed since you and Dad's days. Don't interfere. I'm doing things my way." From his tone, I realized the company wasn't forcing the overtime and weekend work on him. What was going on? He used to complain about our father always working when he was young. He never seemed that work-driven, seeing work merely as a means to earn money and live. Anna knew this well, which is probably why she confided in me. My concern turned into suspicion from that day on. Sure enough, my unease grew over time. Then, soon after, I received shocking news. Anna died. Tearful calls from Anna's parents reached me, informing me of the tragic news. Anna was hit by a truck while wandering aimlessly on the highway. She was walking in a non-pedestrian area at night, unnoticed by the truck driver. Anna was serious and gentle, so she wouldn't recklessly cross a highway. At least, that's what I think. I later learned that she had been absent-minded for some time before the accident. Her parents mentioned receiving distressing calls from her, occasionally sounding like screams. Hearing this, my blood ran cold. It was said that Mark was having an affair. Anna was aware that the other woman was Molly, an office worker at Mark's workplace. Why she was in such a dangerous place remains unclear. However, Anna's parents believed that the shock of Mark's affair drove her to neurosis. After ending the call, I remained stunned for a while. Receiving a message from Fred about heading to the hospital, I finally snapped back to reality. By the time I arrived, Fred, who had left work early, was already at the hospital. At the hospital, there were only Anna's parents and Kevin, who was being embraced by them. Of course, the notification of the accident was first sent to Mark, her husband, but it was said that there was no contact from him. Then the message reached Anna's parents, and finally, at the very end, it seems they managed to get in touch with Mark. Even though Mark's office was much closer to the hospital than our house, he was the last to arrive. Without any sign of hurry or panic.
What have you been doing?
Fred exploded at Mark after hearing about the affair and other circumstances. I had never seen him so furious. Yet, Mark was defiant.
I cheated. But Anna's death was an accident, right? It's not my fault. If anything, it's because of Anna.
He blamed the root cause on Anna not paying attention to him after Kevin was born. Once a child is born, parenting becomes the priority. But for Mark, the only son and always the priority at home, he couldn't accept that someone else was being prioritized, even if it was his own son. That's why he couldn't prioritize his son in his life, leading Kevin not to be very attached to him. This vicious cycle made him feel like he had no place at home. In front of the late Anna, Mark yelled that her neurosis was her own fault. At his irresponsible words, Anna's parents broke down in tears, and Fred was almost at the point of hitting him. I could only calm them down and soothe Kevin, who started crying even harder at the sight of the adult's behavior. In that moment, seeing my son's state and feeling powerless, I was overwhelmed with a sense of inadequacy. Thus, a definitive rift formed between us and Mark. We insisted that either Anna's parents or we should take Kevin in, but Mark was unyielding. Though he confessed to the affair at the hospital, there was no further evidence, and since the confession wasn't recorded, Mark's infidelity remained unproven. I was terribly worried about Mark's selfish behavior. Hoping to be of some help, I discreetly gave Kevin a piece of paper with a map to our house and our contact information. It's a bit of a walk from their house to ours, but it's better than nothing. If nothing else, that's fine. And so, we parted ways. Later, I heard through the grapevine that Mark had remarried Molly. Apparently, she is about 10 years younger than Mark. Rumors even said that Molly knew Mark was married when they started their relationship. I was worried about Kevin's relationship with them. I visited Mark's house alone a few times, but it was always dark, and no one answered the doorbell. After several attempts, I had to give up to avoid being reported as a suspicious person. It's been years since I've seen Kevin. Even as the days go by, these old memories keep coming back to me. Even now, sipping hot chocolate, I think of Kevin. He used to enjoy the hot chocolate I made. I wonder if he has grown up, how his life and family relationships are. All I can do is worry. While bringing the mug to my lips, I look outside. A cold wave has hit our area today, turning the view from the window completely white. The surroundings are already engulfed in night and bitterly cold. I'll probably need to shovel snow tomorrow. Honey, it looks like we'll need to shovel snow tomorrow morning. I was about to discuss the snow shoveling with Fred, who was watching TV in front of the fireplace, when the doorbell rang. Fred and I looked at each other. On such a snowy night, we had no idea who could be visiting us. With a bit of fear, I slid open the front door to find a high school-aged boy carrying a small child on his back. I stared intently at their unusual appearance. The boy wore a slightly rumpled white shirt with just the top of a school uniform jacket and worn sweatpants. The small child was dressed in a t-shirt, a light hoodie suitable for fall, and shorts. Both had bright red hands and feet, and there was a thin layer of snow on their heads and shoulders. Long footprints stretched from the pristine white garden to the road beyond. It seemed they had walked to our house in this attire. Then, looking at the boy's face, I gasped. "Are you Kevin?" I hadn't seen Kevin since he was in elementary school, but I was certain. The corners of his eyes drooped like Anna's, and his nose was just like Mark's. Kevin should be a 10th grader now, so the age was right. However, I didn't recognize the child he was carrying.
Grandma, long time no see.
Indeed, the high school-aged boy was Kevin. Tears blurred my vision. I didn't know what to say, torn between the painful sight and the joy of reunion. The grown-up Kevin, unlike me, never showed his emotions openly.
Please, let us stay for the night.
I didn't know what had happened, but there must be a reason they were here in such light clothing on a snowy day. They must have come all this way relying only on the address note I gave Kevin when he was little. It must have been difficult to walk this distance in the snow, carrying a child on his back. I was about to nod as if to say, of course.
Are you kidding me? I can take care of that kid.
Fred, who was supposed to be watching TV in the back of the house, came to the entrance with loud footsteps. It seemed he had overheard our conversation. Seeing him get angry after such a long time made me freeze. Even I, who had been with him so long, was scared, so the high school boy must have been terrified. Worried, I looked at Kevin and the child. But Kevin, unfazed by Fred's demeanor, looked down and muttered softly.
I guess so.
He said, and then smirked. It was a hollow smile, twisting only his mouth, as if everything was as he expected. I felt anger towards Fred for causing such an expression on his grandson's face. No matter how stubborn and unforgiving he was, this was no way to treat his own grandson, who was innocent and once beloved. As I was about to protest, the child on Kevin's back said, "I'm cold," shivering. His hands and feet turned even redder, and his lips grew more purplish. Kevin's legs were trembling, struggling to hold the child any longer. Fred glared at the child on Kevin's back.
We need to go to the hospital first. If you're not going, I'll drive.
What? Oh. Then, with wide eyes, Fred silently grabbed the car keys and quickly headed to the garage. Though his words were harsh, it turned out that Fred was indeed worried about Kevin and the child. He always lacks the right words, saying he can't take care of that kid. He meant that we couldn't properly care for the severely exhausted child at home. That's just the kind of person my husband was. Only then, through my tears, did I notice Fred's urgency. Following his words, I urged Kevin to the garage. You did well to get here. We're going to the hospital, so you can relax now. I can carry the child for you.
No, it's okay.
Kevin looked surprised and then confused. He readjusted the child on his back and walked to the garage as prompted. Kevin seemed to have grown into a very responsible person. Always worried about the child, putting himself last. Even though he was shivering from severe frostbite. Reassuring him was my role in the car. Soon after, we found a hospital open at night, and Kevin and the little child were quickly seen by a doctor. The doctor said they were suffering from frostbite and malnutrition. Fortunately, because we brought them to the hospital immediately, their lives were not in danger. I was relieved. While Kevin and the child were treated in the warm hospital, Fred was not his usual self. He listened intently to the doctor, held their hands to comfort them, and visibly worried. Where had his usual stern face gone? While glancing at him, I waited for Kevin and the child to recover. A few hours later, after they received IV treatment, we were able to head home before dawn. In the car on the way back, I asked Kevin about the small child he was carrying. In the hospital, I had asked Kevin to fill out the forms, and he had written the name Luke in the child's name field. Luke is 5 years old. As expected, Kevin confirmed that Luke is his half-brother, which means he's another grandchild for Fred and me. Tentatively, I asked about their life at home, already hinted at by their scant clothing in winter. Indeed, Kevin said Molly, the new wife, was cold to him because he was from Mark's previous marriage. He was always verbally abused and discriminated against in daily life, including meals. He didn't even receive new clothes, and his school uniform was the warmest clothing he had. Mark, his biological father, showed no interest in Kevin, mostly ignoring whatever Molly did to him. Luke, the child of Mark and Molly, was cherished by them as a baby.
But they gradually stopped caring. Probably became too much of a bother.
They began to shift their responsibility of looking after Luke onto Kevin. They were always self-centered, unable to prioritize their children. Fortunately, Kevin, much older than Luke, cared deeply for him, likely taking care of Luke since his middle school days. It pained me to think that, despite being a teenager who needed care himself, Kevin had to tend to Luke. His earnest care was evident in how closely Luke clung to him. During the drive, Luke, unaccustomed to the car or perhaps the situation, didn't speak a word. Clinging tightly to Kevin, a clear sign of their bond, I finally asked why they had come to our distant home in the dead of winter. Kevin was initially hesitant to explain, but, sensing my concern, he gradually shared their ordeal. Shockingly, Mark and Molly had left the children alone to travel far away, leaving little food and money. Their absence during the winter break worsened the situation. They had absolutely nothing to eat, and Kevin feared that both he and the young Luke would starve if things continued as they were. With schools closed and not wanting to impose on friends, Kevin felt he had no one to turn to. Driven by desperation, he decided to come to our house, tearfully recounting their plight.
Why didn't you contact us before now?
Fred shouted at Kevin, his voice tense while driving. His guilt over not reaching out to Kevin and allowing Mark's tyranny, along with a sense of helplessness, was palpable. Understanding this depth of emotion required years of living with Fred. Fred, don't talk like that. Kevin, Luke, I'm so glad you turned to us in the end. To Kevin and Luke, Fred must have seemed like a scary grandfather. I reassured them, not seeing any fear on their faces. Perhaps because they sensed his genuine concern at the hospital.
I thought about contacting you many times, but I hesitated because of what Mom used to say, worrying it might be true.
Kevin looked guilty as he explained why he hadn't reached out to us. After Mark remarried, Molly frequently yelled at him, saying,
"You're not loved by your grandparents. You're a nuisance no matter where you go. So don't even think about relying on them."
I used to think it was a lie because my memories of you were always kind.
However, repeatedly hearing those words made him start to believe they might be true.
I remember being loved and well treated by you in my childhood, and now I can see that there's no way my grandparents would hate me. But until recently, I somehow felt unloved.
Molly had manipulated him into not seeking help from us. That's why you smiled when Fred shouted, isn't it? Kevin nodded. When Fred yelled at the entrance, Kevin's smile seemed to reflect a bitter realization, aligning with the harsh words of his stepmother, Molly. Hearing this, Fred looked even more regretful. Kevin expressed, through tears, that finally feeling protected by his grandparents gave him peace. Luke, perhaps influenced by his brother's crying or the release of tension, also began to cry. Upon arrival at our home, they immediately went to the prepared bed.
"It's warm, Kevin."
Luke murmured, sniggling into the blanket, embraced by Kevin, both falling into a deep sleep. I felt a mix of love and sadness, tears rolling down my cheeks. Realizing they probably hadn't slept comfortably and safely like this for a long time. Fred and I wanted to keep watching Kevin and Luke's sleeping faces. But there were urgent matters to attend to. Once day broke, Fred took the car out again, with the medical reports to file a complaint against Mark and Molly. We prepared while waiting for their return. Weeks later, when Mark and Molly returned from their trip, they were arrested by the police who were waiting at their home. Initially, Mark accused Fred and me of kidnapping, maintaining this claim even when faced with evidence, reflecting how selfish and terrible he had become. At the trial, the face of Mark, whom I hadn't seen in a long time, had become even more severe than when we last parted. I wonder how things ended up like this. Did we, as a couple, make a mistake in how we raised him? Or was there some significant turning point in Mark's journey to adulthood? It might be too late to ponder these questions now, but seeing my son hurling harsh words in court made me realize we've reached a point of no return. For now, let's focus solely on protecting Kevin and Luke, who have been deeply wounded in their hearts. After discussing with Fred, we resolved to be thoroughly supportive and stand by our grandchildren. Eventually, Mark and Molly were arrested for child neglect, with the medical reports of malnutrition being crucial evidence. Our testimonies likely reinforced the decision. Suddenly, Kevin and Luke were left alone. They wanted to stay with us after their parents were arrested. However, doubting our capability to raising a neglectful son, we consulted Anna's parents. They expressed relief over their grandchildren's safety and concern for Luke, despite no blood relation, wishing to take both in. However, they expressed regret that it would be difficult for them to take in Luke, as there was no blood relation. They mentioned it would be cruel to separate the brothers, and therefore our home, where the siblings could stay together, was the best option. They also promised that they would help each other going forward. Moved by their kindness despite the wrongs Mark did to their daughter Anna, I found myself easily moved to tears. Hence, Kevin and Luke ended up in our care. Holding their hands, promising a shared life ahead, they showed bright, blossoming smiles. Initially reserved like shy cats in their new home, they soon warmed up to us. Kevin often helps out around the house. Despite the heavy snowfall this year, he has been eager to help with shoveling the snow. Young Luke, imitating what he sees, also goes outside with a shovel in hand. Luke, perhaps in the phase of wanting to imitate everything, copies everything his brother does. Fred, while grumbling, taught them how to shovel snow. Evidently delighted by their reliance on him.
Can't you guys even do this? Absolutely hopeless.
Fred grumbled with a stern face, his usual way of scolding. However, Kevin and Luke seemed to understand that it was just his way of hiding his embarrassment, and they would just smile and let it roll off their backs.
We'll get better than Grandpa soon, right, Kevin?
Yeah, maybe we'll surpass him by tomorrow.
Though my husband continues to be difficult, Kevin and Luke are growing fond of him, embracing his gruffness as part of their affection for their grandfather. I watch their endearing interactions as I prepared a day's meal. Dinner's ready, let's take a break. I call out loudly, and the three of them walk towards me, laughing together. What blissful days these are! Winter is nearing its end, and the season of budding flowers approach us. Warm moments are passing among the four of us.